Hello everyone, um, my name is Jeremy, and this is a short video that I've titled, Why Did I Convert to Eastern Orthodoxy? And I want to make this partially because I'm sick right now, and I figure it's a better use of my time to try and make at least some kind of Orthodox video instead of just lying around playing the Binding of Isaac all day. And I've also wanted to share this story for a while, partially as a sort of video diary for myself, and also for a bit of outreach. So, when we're looking into why I converted to Eastern Orthodoxy, I first want to take a look at the quote from Matthew 11:29, "Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." I feel like this quote really encapsulates my spiritual journey, which led me to Eastern Orthodoxy, and I think that the yoke that Christ gives us is very present in the Eastern Orthodox Church when compared to the other Christian denominations. So I'll start out by giving a little overview of my religious upbringing. I wasn't very religious at all as a child, but my family started going to a Unitarian Universalist church when I was 9, and I've included the famous, well, famous isn't a great word for it, but the always present coexist symbol, because it really encapsulates sort of the Unitarian Universalist phronema, if you will. It is very much focused on what in the Orthodox Church we would call ecumenism, or the sort of belief that compromising views of religious beliefs is better than maintaining them and being exclusive about them. Unitarians believe in 7 very basic principles relating to democracy and the freedom of the human conscience to search for religions, and it doesn't focus very much on theological dogmas or beliefs. It's more focused on progressive political views and building a community. However, when I was 12, I took a class for my religious education in the UU Church, which compared all the major religions and allowed us to experience some of the spiritual life of each. We would go and visit once a week, or learn about some kind of new major religion. So we talked about Buddhism, Hinduism, Protestantism, and Catholicism, no Orthodoxy, but we also talked about Judaism and the Islamic faith, among some others. And during that, I discovered Catholicism, and I felt very pulled to it. This was around when I was 12 or 13, and something really just spoke to me about Catholicism in my heart, and I started to believe that that was the truth. So this is what I refer to as my Catholic arc. I decided to enroll into RCIA, which is essentially a catechism class which is intended for adults, but really this was teenagers like myself who were entering into the faith or being confirmed. And I got baptized in a normal Catholic church on Easter 2014. Now, this normally would be sort of a story about a young teen discovering Catholicism and really embracing it the whole time, but I wasn't exactly the most philosophically or theologically educated, so very shortly after my Catholicism arc, I discovered atheism, especially, the new atheism. People like Richard Dawkins, Christopher Hitchens, Daniel Dennett, Sam Harris, and of course, Reddit. So this was the start of what I call my atheistic period. It pretty much comprised most of my high school years. And even though atheism, at least at the time, I subscribed to the more modern definition of it as a lack of belief rather than some kind of belief system, I was very strongly atheistic. And really, it formed the core of my being, I would say. It was the main focus of my life. It was the main thing I read about. It was how I identified myself with other people and thought of myself. And at the same time, I engaged in politics and was very much of the progressive breed. My politics were very democratic. They were, I believe I would have referred to myself as a socialist, like a pretty generic high school socialist. Growing up in a liberal area, I kept going to the Unitarian Church um, because, quite frankly, the majority of people at the Unitarian Universalist Church are already not theistic. And, I embraced a life that was very focused on um, liberal politics, especially around my peers in school. It was a major topic of discussion, and you know, I tended to find friends who were like me. Now, eventually, I started to explore the philosophical implications of atheism, and gradually I started shifting towards more experiential religions. This was also during high school. I would say this is around 2015, 2016, leading into 2017. So I really came to view myself as a nihilist. And of course, now I look back and I realize that, the edgy nihilist teen is really more of a trope. And I essentially was just a trope and a caricature. But at the time, I thought this was very serious stuff. Um, because, well, when you are really embracing the typical progressive atheist kind of worldview, it's usually very positive. It's focused on, progressing beyond the rudimentary or antiquated religion um, of the past, and moving on to something better, something that's more accepting and more welcoming. I guess from their view, that's how they would view it. But when I really started to feel more and more pulled towards nihilism, I realized that this was somewhat of a facade, because really, from my perspective at the time, if there was no God, if there was no purpose to the world, then everything was merely pulling us to death, to extinction, and to blackness. And, there's so much tribulation in life, there's so much difficulty, and why is it even worth going through it at all? So, to answer these sorts of questions, I started to read into Zen and Buddhism as a whole. Mainly, I focused on secular Buddhism, as it's called, which is really more of a naturalistic approach to meditation. So, something like Zen. One of my favorite books at the time was Zen Mind, Beginner's Mind, which was not made by a secular Buddhist, but it was made by a popular Zen teacher, Shumryu Suzuki. And I still think there's a lot of good wisdom in that book. It really talks a lot about how the interior life is really the way to overcome suffering and nihilism, and honestly, most importantly, that we always need to view ourselves as beginners, because the second we view ourselves as advanced, we become less than the beginner who's always trying to explore and learn. And this has remained something very useful to me and helpful for me, especially as I've become Orthodox. But I'll get into that in a tiny bit. I also started to consider more conservative branches of Buddhism as the possible answer, because Buddhism really spoke to me as someone who thought of it as an experiential religion, something that was based on the truths of life as we live them. So, for example, Buddhism has a doctrine called dukkha, which is a belief in frustration, and the fact that frustration comes from bad and negative desires that we have that are focused around our ego. So, it is the belief of conservative Buddhists, especially the Theravada movement, that views itself as the original teaching of the Buddha, that when we have a negative desire that's focused on the ego, and things don't go our way, we inevitably run into frustration, we inevitably run into suffering. And this really appealed to me as someone who was coming from nihilism in high school. Especially in high school. I'm sure you know what I mean. Lots of suffering there, lots of frustration. And I started to consider the possibility that things like gods existed, not the Christian God, but deities and other beings, other realms, rebirth, things like that. And my evidence for that at the time was just that Buddhism seemed to be so based on what I'd experienced that perhaps there was some truth to it after all. I started practicing meditation about 20 minutes per day. I started reading books about Buddhism, mainly the Buddha's teachings, which I'm looking at in my room because I haven't really known what to do with it since I left Buddhism, and it's pretty much just sitting on my bookshelf unopened and collecting dust in between my more religious books. But to stop rambling during this section, I started drifting back towards Catholicism in 2018 as I started to explore more classical theist philosophy. So I have a picture of Thomas Aquinas up there and the Latin Mass beneath. I became really interested in the traditional teachings of Catholicism after I looked into Thomism and discovered that maybe the arguments for the existence of God weren't as clear-cut as someone like Richard Dawkins would have portrayed them as. And I was very convinced by the Thomistic view for quite a long time, but I started to experience some cognitive dissonance, I believe. And again, this was in my early college era. I entered college in 2018. I started going to our Catholic campus ministry and our local Catholic church, and something just didn't sit right with me. Of course, everyone knows that the Catholic Church is plagued with various scandals that I don't believe I need to go into, because just me saying that probably gives you everything you need to know. But these weren't necessarily the things that made me doubt the Catholic position and the Catholic worldview. It was more so issues like the Second Vatican Council, which is a very major sticking point for a lot of traditionalist Catholic groups. And as time went on, I started drifting more and more towards these traditional groups. I started attending the Latin Mass instead of what's known as the Ordinary Form or the Novus Ordo Mass that was implemented during and after Vatican II by some of the more recent popes. And I just gradually became more, disenfranchised from the Catholic world around me. Eventually, I started flirting with SSPX groups and Sedevacantist groups, and these are very obscure, small Catholic groups that most regular people wouldn't really know about. But there's a whole lot of meat there. There's sort of an iceberg, if you will, of just more and more radical Catholic groups. And I started to fall into those, and I had some major cognitive dissonance, such as, wondering how my theological positions could be the right ones, because after all, I'm no prophet. I've been wrong about so many things. Having been in all sorts of different religions, how do I know that I'm correct this time? And this was something that really stressed me out. Especially because when you get into traditional Catholicism, there's all sorts of different groups that are competing and claiming that they have the one true church with them, and that all other people are going to hell outside of those groups. And of course, this is a very unpleasant life to live, and it's also one that ultimately eats itself. Sort of like nihilism itself, it really has a worldview that isn't founded on anything. Just your own human reasoning. And especially this seemed weird to me because Catholics believe that the Pope is the basis of how we know various things. This is something that Catholic apologists bring up all the time, that we can't know the truth without the Pope. And so when I was trying to live a traditional Catholic life, and I started to realize that the popes in Rome were saying things that traditional Catholics viewed as contradictory to past popes and past aspects of the magisterium, I started to wonder, how can I have my cake and eat it too? How can I, on the one hand, say that everyone needs to be under the Pope and listen to the Pope, and then reject the Apostolic See of Rome as being anathema or as being heretical or false? And this essentially led me to not necessarily nihilism again, but it led me into a very schizophrenic era. And not literally schizophrenic. I don't have hallucinations or hear voices or anything, but I was very much torn on Catholicism. I wasn't sure what to do at all, but I felt that it was the truth because, quite frankly, I didn't really know anything else. But thankfully, as I went through this winding road of all sorts of different religions and continued looking into things further, I discovered Orthodoxy. And it took me a really long time to even get into Orthodoxy because I was really scared that, if I went to an Orthodox church, I would be an apostate from Catholicism, and because of that, I might end up in hell. But after doing a lot of soul searching and a lot of reading, a lot of listening, I came to the conclusion that Orthodoxy is the only religion that has a worldview that's sustainable on itself, that isn't viciously circular, as a lot of Orthodox apologists and philosophers like to discuss, and it really possesses the fullness of the truth. So I was received into Eastern Orthodoxy on December 12th, 2021. I still really admired a lot about my Catholic sort of upbringing. Upbringing isn't the best word, but you get my point. And I decided to take St. Christopher, the martyr of Lycia, as my patron saint, because he is one of the most popular worldwide saints, especially in places like Italy. And he isn't quite as venerated as much in Catholicism today, but in Eastern Orthodoxy he's considered one of the many martyrs, one who came to Christianity, was tempted in many ways by the Roman authorities, and ended up giving his life for Christ, which is really something that I want to do now that I am Orthodox, and now that I'm here and I am talking about specifically how I was received into Eastern Orthodoxy. I also want to explain what makes Orthodoxy so great. So I would say that my conversion to Orthodoxy was 95% intellectual, and the remaining 5% of my intellectual life remains in my Orthodox life today. So honestly, the math really doesn't work out here, but it sounds better as a little catchphrase than it does actually considering the math. What I really mean to say here is that when I was coming into religion, everything was focused on rational arguments and not necessarily apologetics, but philosophy and theology. But now, as an Orthodox Christian, I don't actually spend all that much time overly philosophizing about things. And I think that this is a problem that a lot of religions have. They're just a bit too focused on scholastic ideas. They're a bit too focused on human reasoning and the human mind. And Orthodoxy is very different from this. The Orthodox life, for just a standard Orthodox Christian, consists of going to church, making friends, and fulfilling your prayer role, among other things. So I listen to the authority of my spiritual father, and I try to do my prayer role. And by the way, the authority of my spiritual father isn't necessarily a strict thing. It's a very healthy way to get rooted in the Orthodox life. So my prayer role is very simple. It probably takes about 20 minutes each day to do, and just trying to do your prayer role with enthusiasm rather than mechanically, and trying to grow every day in your faith a little bit is really helpful. And we have a lot of modern saints or people who lived very holy lives and were canonized by the church, such as the pictured Saint Sophrony, who was a monk from Mount Athos who studied under another saint from Mount Athos before eventually realizing that England needed an Orthodox presence and establishing a monastery there called the Monastery of St. John the Baptist in Essex. And his life is really a fantastic example of contemporary Orthodox holiness, something that all Orthodox Christians can aspire to, just in terms of living lovingly, simply, and trying to fight our bare bones temptations for the sake of God. Now, another example of this contemporary Orthodox witness is St. Paisios the Athonite, who died in 1994. For the record, St. Sophrony died in 1993, but St. Paisios is one of the most famous modern Orthodox saints, and he really encapsulates that Orthodoxy isn't just dogma, it's a way, it's truth, and it's also our life itself. This is something that Buddhism used to really speak to me in regards to, because what I really liked about trying to live a Buddhist life is that it was more than just believing in these scholastic ideas, as I've said. It was also about implementing the teachings into your life and finding peace by doing the right thing and living as you're really supposed to. And while Buddhism has a ton of problems in it, I feel, and it didn't actually end up helping me much at all, Orthodoxy really, to put it in a whippersnapper term, I mean, I'm still pretty young, I hope, but Orthodox life hits different. It's much more peaceful. It is very fulfilling to know that you're going in the right direction, and there's a simplicity to it. Just doing your morning and evening prayers, reading good spiritual books that aren't too high above your pay grade, and making Orthodox friends, going to church, being at coffee hour for massive periods of time, sometimes, getting sick because you just want to stay there longer and longer, and, I could be kicked off of YouTube if I clarify anymore, but anyone Orthodox watching this will know what I mean to some extent. And having these contemporary witnesses really is a very, very powerful thing, especially because in Orthodoxy we believe that our contemporary holy figures, as well as all the holy figures, well, not all of them, but some of the holy figures from our 2,000-year tradition of Eastern Orthodox Christianity, and even many holy people before then, having all these examples, having a contemporary life in Christ, and also one that is ancient and that has an unceasing line of apostolic succession, as it's called. So going back all the way to the church that Christ established with the 12 apostles. It really is distinct from every other religion that I've ever been a part of, and it really is exceedingly beautiful just to live an Orthodox life on a daily basis. Now, I also would argue that Eastern Orthodoxy is a very radical path. I would call it the most radical path. When we see our world today, we see a world that's filled with division, that's filled with a loss of meaning, a lot of very progressive ideas, and a lot of very conservative ideas constantly fighting. And Orthodoxy somewhat rejects both the mainstream conservative and the mainstream liberal approach, because it really is focused on the things above this world. Now, that's not to say that Orthodoxy has no position in politics, or more accurately, position on politics, because really it has very little position in politics today. But again, historically, if you want to run down on that, you can always look at Orthodox sources on these questions. But that is besides the point. Orthodoxy really goes beyond a lot of the political struggles that we have today. So on questions relating to social justice, Orthodoxy would really take a position that is unique among all the religions, because we as Orthodox Christians understand that true social equality can only be achieved within the Orthodox worldview. It isn't really something that humans can find on their own. So our conception of even human rights would certainly be different from the views of, let's say, a secular atheist and a literal, not saying this is a buzzword, a literal neo-Nazi. Our ideas of what the ideal government would look like, and how we can preserve justice in society, ultimately comes down to how we are living as spiritual people, as good people, as people that Christ want us to be, rather than some kind of exceedingly based structure of government that we're all searching for, or some kind of revolution. And in doing so, by realizing that um, a political solution alone is not the answer, and you know, combating all sorts of injustice by reforming ourselves first and living the spiritual life that God Himself, who became man, wants us to live for Him. Orthodoxy really goes beyond all of the so-called revolutionary or radical or reactionary systems that we see today. So Orthodoxy in and of itself is not right-wing, it's not left-wing in the sense that we have it today. Certainly on social issues it leans quite conservative, but by no means is Orthodoxy advocating for any sort of violence in really any area. It would deeply and has deeply rejected violence on both sides, and this is a major reason that Orthodoxy is focused on the interior life, but it's also focused on spreading that interior life to others. Because as Saint Seraphim of Sarov said, a spirit of peace will, acquiring a spirit of peace will save thousands. Essentially, that being what he said. Orthodoxy is not something that we just accept the dogmas of and never do anything about. Saint Seraphim is saying that when we acquire a spirit of peace and show it to others, tell others why the Orthodox life is our joy, then we can save thousands of others, because they too will start to act in the same way and acquire the spirit of peace. So really it is the most radical path. It is not bringing peace in the sense it brings complete equanimity with everything around us, and the sword is that we defend what is true. It is not advocating for any sort of forced conversion or anything silly like that. And these are all things that really speak to me. There's something exciting and always new about Orthodoxy. It's not just a museum. It's also applying ancient and always present truth to the modern day. And honestly, we don't know exactly how that's going to end in America. We don't know how it's going to end anywhere around the world where Orthodoxy is growing. And there's something very exciting about that. Seeing our faith grow among all sorts of different ethnicities and groups, people coming to the church, people loving the Orthodox saints that we have who are so peaceful and kind themselves, and even great missionaries like the pictured St. John Maximovich, a great archbishop of the Russian church abroad who died, I believe, in 1968. Orthodoxy really has a special way of not only touching our own hearts, but spreading itself to the world in a true act of revolutionary passion and love. And the final thing I'll mention is that Orthodoxy is messy. If anyone has ever been on Orthodox social media of any sort, really, they will immediately know that Orthodoxy is fraught with controversies, it's fraught with difficulties, but that's not really anything different in the church. The church has always been, as St. Basil says, like different crews fighting on ships. While the ship is sinking and people are shooting at each other, the church goes on. And the church itself remains one. We remain one in faith. We remain one in truth, charity, and love. I totally just said something absurd in saying that we're one in charity, but bear with me. We are still one body of Christ. Christ is one. God is one, although he is also three persons. The three persons are one essence. Hopefully that's not too scholastic to say. And just like that, Christ's body, or the church, is also one. So despite us being human and us being fallible, Orthodoxy itself is more than just the fallible humans that comprise it. So Orthodoxy isn't going to make you an instantly perfect person. You're still going to be exposed to all sorts of controversies and difficulties, and the spiritual life itself is not even a straight line. It's really a winding road where sometimes you fall down and you have to get up. But there's really a beauty and a joy in our messy lives going to one purpose. So Orthodoxy is a straight and narrow path, and yet our experience getting to that path and remaining on that path can be very difficult, painful, and quite frankly tough. But it's all worth it in the end, because really, as you go down the path and you rise back up every time you fall, you know that you're doing the right thing. You know that you're fighting for the truth in your own heart, and you know that God is with you and with everyone who is fighting alongside you. So this went for longer than I thought it would by a significant margin, but I really wanted to share my experience coming to Eastern Orthodoxy. I wanted to clarify some misconceptions that I feel are prominent these days about Eastern Orthodoxy and converts to Eastern Orthodoxy. And despite me rambling on for a while, I hope you enjoyed the video. God bless you, and Happy New Year.